Hi, my name is Richard Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to the Letcher County History Show. Today we're going to be talking about what is known as the Forgotten Battle, which was the fight over the Aleutian Islands in Alaska between the United States and Japan during World War II. A lot of people are not aware that the Japanese actually invaded Alaska and was that close to America, but they were, and they had taken two of the Aleutian Islands there in Alaska. And this was in what they considered the North Pacific, and it's called the North Pacific Struggle. Well, before the war, General Billy Mitchell had appeared before Congress, and this is what he had said to them there at Congress. He said, "I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world, and I think it is in the most important strategic place in the world." And that was coming from one of America's top generals at that time, Billy Mitchell. So he thought that Alaska was very important, as well as did everyone else. Well, the Japanese hoped to make bases there in Alaska, and you can see why, because then they could take and build an Air Force base there, and they could direct bombing raids down around to the west coast, along through Canada and down through California. And their planes would be able to return back safely to their base there in Alaska. And the United States, of course, would hope to hold bases there to do the same, except instead of, they would in turn be trying to run bombing runs toward Japan, because it would be the closest place to Japan from any place in America. So you can see it was a strategic place for both sides, both Japanese and American. The plan to invade the Aleutian Islands was designed by Admiral Yamamoto, the famous naval officer that was in charge of Pearl Harbor and the other Midway and all the other battles in the South Pacific. He decided that it would also be a good diversion, and he hoped to destroy the United States Navy, what was left of it, dividing them up, because he knew that part of the Navy would have to go north to go after this portion of his Navy when he sent it into the North Pacific, which was a very sound plan. But fortunately for the Americans, they had managed to break the code, the Japanese code, and they caught this information and knew what the Japs were planning, or partly knew anyway. They didn't tell the whole thing, but they knew that they were trying to pull the Americans out where they could destroy them piece by piece. Well, Yamamoto sent Colonel Yamasaki and a bunch of the Japanese army soldiers aboard a bunch of transport ships and a big naval fleet that went to the North Pacific. This fleet contained 2 aircraft carriers, so they meant business. So this big naval armada sailed up into the North Pacific and sailed close to Alaska. And here, on June the 3rd, they attacked, decided to send out the bombers, which was Cape torpedo bombers, off the carriers and sent them to Dutch Harbor, which was close. It was part of the islands as well. You know, at Dutch Harbor there was a U.S. base there that also had a small landing field. Well, when the Cape bombers got there, the Japanese bombers, they wasn't expecting any resistance, but there was a small group of fighters, planes from the United States there, that got in the air and managed to disrupt the bombing raids, which caught the Japanese by surprise because they weren't expecting any resistance. So they fell back and went back to their carriers. But the next day, they come back in full force and sent all the bombers they had. And this time, the small amount of fighter planes there that the Americans could put up was no match for them, and they managed to bomb Dutch Harbor. After Dutch Harbor had been burnt and the landing strip damaged and all the planes destroyed, on June the 6th, the Japanese put landing ships aboard there at Kiska Island. which was part of the Aleutian Islands there of of Alaska. Well, there was hardly anyone there to resist them, just a few natives. Then they went to Attu Island, which was next to it, and took it on the very next day, June the 7th. Now, both of these islands were just big, craggy, snow-covered mountains, and they were covered with, and down in the valleys we would have soil, which covered with what they called muskeg, which was black old muck covered with lichens and moss, and it was just growed everywhere that way. There was hardly any vegetation outside this. Well, then the Japanese went to the top of the hills. They knew that they would have to defend the place, and they built caves into the mountains and fortified them because they knew they would probably be bombed as well. So now they were fortified very well. So they had everything ready in case the Americans decided to take the place back. And the Americans naturally was going to. So as soon as this happened, the Americans just knew that Nome, Alaska was next on the list. So they began rushing men, soldiers, and artillery and tanks there as fast as they could. But they had nothing much to transport them by. So they commandeered civilian airplanes, big cargo planes and so forth, to start sending men and supplies to Nome, Alaska. And they managed to fortify Nome. Whether this prevented the Japanese from attacking or not is not known, but the Japanese did not attack Nome. But getting back to Attu and Kiska, at Kiska they had a real nice harbor there, so the Japanese Navy could pull into the harbor and be protected there. Plus there was a landing strip there at Kiska. So now they could do exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to take and begin building them an air place that they could attack the United States. Well, of course, the United States could not accept this, so they sent General Simon Buckner to take over the Nome and the Alaska defense. Now, Simon Buckner was a Kentuckian. He was born and raised in Munfordville, Kentucky, and his father was the famous Civil War general, General Simon Buckner as well. So he was Simon Buckner Jr. And now he was a general. And General Buckner decided that the best way to do it was to island hop, like they would eventually do, like at Aojima and other places. So the first thing he did was he went to an island not far from there called Adak and built an Air Force base there. And from here he started bombing the Attu and Kiska, and plus the Japanese Navy. And he concentrated on Kiska because, of course, it was the one most important. Well, the Japanese Navy at this time was involved in the gigantic Battle of Midway. And, of course, as we all know, at it, the United States surprisingly beat Admiral Yamamoto there and defeated him. Well, this caused Japanese some problems because they lost some of their carriers. So they had to pull the two carriers that were up in the North Pacific away from the naval fleet there and bring them back and let them join Yamamoto back, which just weakened the Japanese Navy. Well, this helped the Americans greatly because they had a weak Navy force up there as well. So now the United States Navy attacked the Japanese Navy and defeated them in March of 1943, in which now, with the Japanese Navy defeated and had to pull out and leave, the only way to supply their troops on Attu and on Kiska was by Japanese submarines. So during the nights, Japanese submarines would come and bring more food and ammunition to the soldiers that were on Attu and Kiska. Well, then Buckner decided to land on the next island closest to Kiska, which was Ammonachuk. And here they went in and landed with landing craft there, but they got hit just as they got started to land on the shore, what they called a wallowag, which was a violent squall hit, and it absolutely demolished the landing craft and just about wiped out the United States men there, just from the weather alone, not from the Japanese. But they managed to get a beach hold on and they managed to make a place for American soldiers to stay. And this will make them a lot closer to Attu and Kiska. Well, at this time, we also, here in Letcher County, had at least one soldier that we know of, and probably more, that were there in the Aleutian Islands. And this soldier's name was Kurt Holbrook. And now this uniform you're getting ready to look at was Curtis Holbrook's uniform. And as you can see, it was the gloves themselves and the headgear were pretty warm, but the rest of the uniform would not have been. And this was the problem that the American troops were going to run into. They didn't have any cold weather uniforms, extreme cold weather, like what you're seeing here. This uniform here was just a normal uniform, but added with the fancy gloves and a nice headpiece. But so Curtis and the rest of the United States Army now had their work cut out for them. They were going to have to take and invade Attu and Kiska and take them back from the Japanese, because just bombing them wouldn't do it working, because they were fortified in their caves. But so we had soldiers from Letcher County throughout the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Europe. So we had Letcher Countians were everywhere fighting, just like any other place. Well, after the Japanese Navy had been defeated, and like I say, the submarines had to supply them, Buckner knew, and the time was right now to take and try to attack and retake Attu and Kiska. So on May 11th of 1943, the American soldiers began to prepare to take Attu back, because Attu was going to be the first one they would take back. The Navy tried to bombard the Japanese defenses, but the weather got so bad that they just couldn't even see the defenses, nevertheless bomb them, and the ships were moving back and forth so violently. But they did manage to bombard them some and give them some hopes of having weakened them. But on May the 11th, the first American soldiers went ashore, and these soldiers were called Kastner's Cutthroats, and they were made up of scouts, and these scouts were mostly Alaskan natives. So this was the first time that Alaskan natives would be used in combat. So these first soldiers went ashore and established a beachhead. Then the 7th Infantry Division come in behind them. Now this is where another irony of war happened, because the 7th Division had been in the deserts of California training for desert warfare to be sent to North Africa. And here, after they just got trained for fighting in the desert, where did they get sent? But to the cold Alaska wilderness. So they went from one extreme to the other extreme, which even hurt even worse, because first off, they only had normal winter weather clothing, which was not that good for Alaska winters. And plus, their bodies had been temperatured in for fighting in the desert. But needless to say, they still managed to fight their way up onto the beach and fight their way into the valleys. But the Japanese had gathered in the hills all around them. So now the Americans were going to have to take the mountains, all these fortified caves. And it was very, very bad weather. Cold, dense fog, cold wind blowing all the time, and there was no way the aircraft could hardly support them because of the bad weather. And then plus, Buckner had thought that they could take the islands in 3 days. And he had thought about the uniforms, but he thought, well, for 3 days, these men can probably stand it for 3 days in these scant uniforms. But it didn't work out that way. As they tried to fight their way up, they found out that between the weather and the terrain and the fierce fortified positions, it wasn't that easy to take. And they couldn't get tanks or artillery in there because it kept sinking down in that muskeg. So there was no way to support the army. They're going to have to do it on foot, and unfortunately that's what they did. But they managed to do it. They kept pushing and pushing, and finally they pushed all the Japanese soldiers into one location. And here Colonel Yamasaki decided that his only chance was to do a suicide charge, and the famous or infamous, or how you want to look at it, banzai charge was about to occur. This was on May 29th, 2.5 weeks after the first American troops had come ashore. And on that night, just as the soldiers had hunkered down the best they could and trying to stay warm, out of those caves come all these Japanese soldiers, and they swarmed down the mountainsides and hit the Americans head on. And the Americans fought them pretty good for a while, but they couldn't hold up to that onslaught. And the Japanese broke through and managed to get down to Massacre Bay. But here, a lot more American soldiers had gathered, and they managed to wipe out the Japanese invaders. They tried to get the Japs to surrender, but the Japanese would not, and ended up only 28 soldiers surrendered, and over 3,000 died. So you can see this was the beginning of those famous banzai charges and suicide charges that the Americans would see from then on as they moved throughout the South Pacific. But you got to remember, now you're in the North Pacific, in the Western Hemisphere. So the Americans have finally defeated the Japanese on Attu and have taken it. So now they turn their attention to Kiska, and they start bombing it. And the weather gets a little bit better, so they're managing to bomb it a little bit more. Then the fog moves back in again. But finally, they decide that in August of 1943, they're ready to send in the army again. So once more, they land on Kiska, and once more, Kastner's cutthroats, those Alaska natives, charge first ashore, and then the 7th Infantry comes ashore, and then so does the Canadian conscripts. The Canadian soldiers had been promised if they would join the Canadian Army, they wouldn't be sent out of their homeland. And of course, the Canadian government considered Alaska part of the area close to Canada, so they thought that honored their agreement with them. But so you had this is the very first time that Canadian conscripts would fight in World War II. It wouldn't be the last, but it would be the first. But all these soldiers swarms ashore at Kiska, and they start running into booby traps everywhere and getting wounded and killed here, and plus the weather as well. But eventually they can't find hardly any Japanese soldiers. And this being because during one of those fog nights, mini fog nights, the Japanese had evacuated the vast majority of the Japanese soldiers off of the island. So it didn't take the Americans long to take Kiska, but they still suffered several casualties due to the weather, due to the booby traps, and then also they had several instances of friendly fire there as well. So by August 24th of 1943, both islands had now been cleared of the Japanese, and the Americans had won a decisive battle. So they were very proud of this and proud of themselves, but the toll had been costly. There were almost 549 Americans were killed, 1,100 wounded, and 2,100 were incapacitated by frostbite and trench foot because of the terrible weather. So this, the taking of Attu was second only in casualties and intensity to Iwo Jima, which everyone knows how terrible that battle was. So the Americans have now just pushed the Japanese out of the Western Hemisphere and off of American soil. So the threat is gone. But the psychological effect had been very tough as well, because now the people in California could breathe a sigh of relief, and also the people of Alaska, because they knew now that the Japanese could not reach them with their bombers. And there was an added bonus when they took Kiska at the landing site. Why the Japanese didn't destroy the plane, no one ever found out. But there was a Mitsubishi, what we call the Zero fighter, still there intact. And the American government soldiers were able to capture that plane intact. But this was a great thing, because now it's the very first time that they'd had a Zero in their possession. And so they used it to figure out how to fight against the Zero, because it was a very good fighter plane. And so they worked out their techniques on how to fight against the Zero, and this came from being captured here at Kiska. So that was an added bonus. And the American soldiers would stay on the Aleutian Islands there in Alaska and guard Alaska for the remainder of the war. But the Japanese never again tried to take them. They did send a few warships that way a few times, but they were always beaten back. So at this time, I would like to show you some pictures that of the Aleutian affair. Okay, this map here is of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, as you can see. Here was Dutch Harbor, where the United States base was, and then here was Attu, and here is Kiska. Those were the two islands that were taken by the Japanese. Then when the United States started fighting back, they set an air base on Adak. Then they ended up sending troops and taking Amchitka and setting them up there, and that way, see, they could take back Kiska and Attu from Amchitka. And you can see that this was not that far from Alaska, and then from the western coast of the United States, California and so forth. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the Aleutian Islands were like. And anybody that watches Deadly Catch on TV will probably recognize these names because you'll see them all the time during Deadly Catch, especially Dutch Harbor. And then now, looking here, this picture here is the picture. This is a normal picture of the battle at Attu. This is, and you can see that these soldiers has just got normal winter coats on and winter pants, and they got their digging devices to dig into the tundra. And you can see that you can see why these poor soldiers suffered so on this island, because look at how the terrain is: rocky, craggy mountains and valleys. And then when they dig, they're either digging in the snow or digging into the tundra to dig in their breastworks and so forth. So this gives you an idea of what them poor soldiers were fighting in on this terrible, terrible island. Then here are pictures of soldiers on Kiska. So they had learned their lesson well. This is what the soldiers looked like when they went in at Kiska. As you can see, they were very much better prepared for the cold weather in this picture than the previous picture. They had the hats on and the big thick wool and furry coats and the big gloves and so forth. They were much more suited for winter combat, which luckily the Japanese had evacuated the island so they didn't have to fight like they did on Attu. But if they had have had to, they would have been much more suited for the job. In this picture we're going to now, when the battle was over with, they'd established two cemeteries on Attu and on Kiska, one on each, and they buried all the American soldiers and the Canadian soldiers that died in these cemeteries. But in 1946, they found out that the tundra and the muskeg was started taking the cemeteries, and you couldn't even get to see where the cemeteries were for this stuff. So they decided they dug the soldiers up and moved the majority of them back to Anchorage, Alaska, to Fort Richardson. But some of the soldiers were shipped back home to the continental United States, to where they were from, if the family requested it. The ones that the family didn't request, of course, went to Anchorage, Alaska, to a military cemetery there. And now going to this picture, you remember we talked about Simon Buckner, General Simon Buckner, the Kentuckian? Well, he had the honor or dishonor, I guess, I don't know how you would say it, but he was the highest ranking soldier to be killed in World War II. And he was a general, of course. And this picture here was taken on Okinawa in 1945, just moments before a mortar landed and killed him. This is General Simon Buckner here. And just as he was well known for his believing in leading from the front. He wasn't a general that stayed back in the back and directed his men. He was always at the front. And of course, this bravery and courage ended up getting him killed, but he was beloved by his men and his other soldiers as well, though, because they knew that he was showing himself to the enemy as well. But you had a famous Kentuckian killed in this battle here, and like I say, that was him just before he was killed. Moments after this picture was taken, a mortar landed and killed him. Well, this battle for Alaska taught the United States a lot of valuable lessons. First, about cold weather, but most important, how to land on these islands and start taking them back, because now in the South Pacific they were going to have to do it as well. And this was the first time they found out that the Japanese would usually fight to the death rather than surrender, just like they just had 28 surrender on that island. So they learned a lot of valuable lessons from this battle. So be sure, and if you'd like to see this uniform, please come down here to the Military Museum and see this uniform, and see uniforms just like it from other aspects of the war. This place is a very beautiful place to visit, and it's free, so please take your time out to come here to the Military Museum and visit this place, because you'll be very proud when you leave here of all the things that Letcher County men and women have done down through the years. I would like to thank you all for watching the Letcher County History Show, and thank you for watching Channel 98. Until next time, goodbye.